Hey y'all, it's Eric with Brook to River Fly Fishing. What if I told you that using nothing but a digital thermometer, I could locate trout on a piece of water that I never laid eyes on before in literally seconds? This is exciting stuff, y'all. If you could find where trout are located in the stream with nothing but a thermometer, wouldn't you want to know? I've got great news. You can do this too. It's not a secret, it's just not talked about that much. All you need to know is the temperature ranges where trout are active, what those look like, and what that means as far as waters that they're going to be found in. Now, I don't want you to just take my word for it. I brought with me today two of my favorite fly fishing books, Tactical Fly Fishing by Devin Olson and Trout Tactics by Joe Humphreys. Both of these books spend a lot of time talking about how you can use a thermometer to figure out where trout might be holding in a river. See, in about 10 seconds, if I take a water temperature, I can use the information I know about where trout hold in the river to pinpoint exactly where they're at, even in water that I haven't ever fished before. You see, while trout live in the same rivers and streams all year long, they don't necessarily stay in the same places in those bodies of water. One of the very most important pieces of information that I look at before I ever start fishing is what's the water temperature. It literally dictates everything from the bug life to the trout's metabolism to where to find the trout. So what exactly are the temperature ranges that trout prefer, and how do those ranges affect feeding? I heard the guys on Trout Bitten lately talking about the fact that trout are ectothermic. That's another way to say that they're cold-blooded. Cold-blooded means that their body temperature is the same as whatever temperature the things that are around them are, which in this case is water. So here in front of me I have a graph of a trout's metabolism versus the temperature of the water that they're in. As a trout's metabolism increases, their need for food also increases dramatically. Now this graph is based on the graph that's in Devin Olson's book, Tactical Fly Fishing. I did check with him about this if I could use this before I made this video. I do have permission, but I think this is very helpful to see this and explain this so that you understand what each range means for trout and their metabolism. In my brain, it makes sense to divide trout activity up into three separate phases: 35 to 45 degrees, 45 to 55 degrees, and 55 to 65 degrees. And we're going to explain all three of those and what they do. As you can see over here at 32 to 35 degrees, their metabolism is super low, and it stays pretty low all the way from 35 degrees to about 45 degrees. At like 32 to 35 degrees, that water is almost freezing. Trout's metabolism is as low as it's going to get. Their need for food is almost zero. They're most likely to be found in those slow, deep pools, possibly slow, deep runs. They're going to be hugging the bottom where the least amount of current is hitting them, and they're going to be trying to conserve as much energy as they can. That's going to hold true as it gets from 35 degrees up to about 45 degrees. 45 is the upper end of that lower section. In that 45 degree temperature range, you're going to start to see trout moving around a little bit. They won't be quite so stuck to their spots, but they're still not moving very much, and there's not a lot happening. After it gets to 45 degrees, somewhere around the 50 degree mark, you can see it starts to drastically go up. This is the range where stuff starts to happen. Bugs start to move, they start to hatch depending on which type of bugs, and fish will respond accordingly. Their 45 degree temperature range is still pretty low. They're not likely to move far, but they will move a little bit possibly. And the 55 degrees is the upper end of that sort of middle section. 55 degrees, trout are going to be very active. They're going to be starting to move into those fast water lies. They're going to be found more in the riffles, in the runs, but they're not necessarily in the heaviest water. They're just sitting close to it so they can still get the benefits of those food coming through there. 45 to 55 degrees, you can expect fishing to be good. It's not always lights out. When it gets between 55 degrees and 65 degrees, that's the peak of a trout's metabolism. That's the highest that it's going to be. Now, 55 degrees to 65 degrees, this is where the magic happens. That's the peak of a trout's metabolism, which means their need for food is way higher than any other time, which means that they're going to be found in the riffles, in the fastest water, sitting in the current sometimes, still maybe behind a little rock or down in a depression, but they're right in the fastest water that you can find. You can cast into the bubble lines, you can cast into the rolling water. Those trout are going to be found everywhere and spread out all throughout the river. I've heard Devin Olson call this type of water that you're looking at right here summer water. In other words, this water is where you'll find trout in the summertime when the water temperatures are warmer and their metabolism is in super high gear. They're much more likely in this temperature range to chase food, which means that even if your cast isn't perfect, maybe your drift isn't perfect, they might still chase your nymph or your streamer down and chase it across lanes even to eat it because they need so much food. This is the time of year where fishing bugs on a swing, like soft hackles, can be deadly because even though it's not dead drifting, if it's imitating a bug that's about to hatch and it's coming up through the water column, those fish will come streaking out of their lives over, whack that thing, and take it back down with them. As an angler that loves to catch fish with a tight line Euro nymphing setup, I absolutely love targeting fish in the summertime in the fastest water that I can find in the river. Number one, the fish generally eat more aggressively. Number two, a lot of times those areas don't get the same pressure that the slow runs and pools do. Number three, most times because of the disturbed nature of the water surface, you can get closer to those fish than you can if they're found in another location. So you can get closer, you can use a tight line nymphing approach, and you can pull those fish out of those riffles and runs and pocket waters that are really moving in the summertime. It's my absolute favorite way to fish. When you drop a perfect cast into a piece of pocket water or a fast run and you're bringing it down through there and a trout just annihilates it, oh gosh, that gets me excited. Once it gets over here to 65 degrees, it starts going down again pretty drastically. Once it gets down here to about 70 degrees, it almost shuts off completely. Now from 65 degrees and up, that bell curve that the trout's metabolism is on, it starts to go down drastically because at those temperatures, it becomes difficult for trout to even survive. That's why there's so much talk about not fishing for trout as the water temperature gets up over 65 and into the 70s, because at that rate, if you catch a trout, especially if you play them for a long time and they exhaust themselves and use up all their energy, those water temperatures can actually be lethal to trout, and so it's not encouraged to fish for trout when water temperatures get into that range. Now, I'm not the water temperature police. I love trout as much as the next person. I want them to thrive. I want them to be healthy. I'm not here to tell you when you need to stop fishing. That's up to you to decide and for you to figure out on your own. All I can tell you for sure is that at 65 degrees and up, that trout metabolism goes very far down and their need for food goes almost down to zero. That doesn't mean that they won't eat. It just means that they'll eat less and that it's going to stress them out if they get caught. I find it ironic that there's a lot of talk out there about using a thermometer to figure out when it's too warm to catch a trout, but not very much talk about using that same thermometer to figure out where the trout might actually be. The best thing about using water temperature to locate trout is that it holds true almost anywhere in the world, not just on your local piece of water. You can literally use this information to find trout and salmonoids all over the world. And while it's worth mentioning that a trout's metabolism looks like this, each species of trout is going to have this peak temperature shifted one way or the other a little bit. For example, brook trout tend to prefer colder water, so you would shift the graph over a little bit. Brown trout can tolerate a little bit warmer water, so you would shift the peak of the metabolism over this way a little bit. But in general, this is a pretty good idea of where most trout prefer to have their water temperature. Now, just because the trout spread out when the water temperature gets warmer doesn't mean that they're not going to be in the pools where they were before. It just means that you're going to also find them in the faster runs, the riffles, the pocket water, all of those types of places. It does mean that if you're looking for feeding trout, that heading to the faster water situations are much more likely to produce feeding trout than the slow, deep pools in those summertime months. Now, when we're trying to understand how water temperature affects trout, it's important to understand the different types of streams and rivers that you're likely to encounter while fishing for them. One type of water that I love to fish is what's called a tailwater. Now, tailwater just means that there's a dam that's damming up a river and creating a lake upstream. And then the bottom of the dam, the water is released out from underneath the dam, and it comes out of there at 53, 54, or 55 degrees all year long. In the summertime, when that water comes out at 53, 54, or 55 degrees, as it goes downstream, it's going to get warmer. That's because the sun's shining on it. If it's not covered by shade, it's going to increase, and it's exposed to that warm air and warm temperature longer as it goes downstream. In the wintertime, on that same tailwater, the water comes out at that 53, 54, 55 degrees, and then it's going to get colder the longer that it goes downstream. That's because as the water goes downstream, it's exposed to the cold outdoor climate, and so it loses its temperature as it goes down the river. That's also the reason that the first mile or two downstream of the dam is year-round usually a great place to fish, because the water's coming out at that consistent temperature all year long, and it hasn't gone downstream far enough to either get warmer in the summer or colder in the winter. Now, a second type of stream or river that's important to know about is what's called a spring creek. Spring creeks are generally influenced heavily by springs. In other words, the water's coming up out of the ground at 53, 54, 55 degrees all year round. Spring creeks, on the other hand, are influenced by how much water is stored in the underground aquifers. If there's been a lot of rain, generally those aquifers are full, the water's coming up out of the ground, and it stays pretty consistent. If it hasn't rained much, there's still water, it's just lower. In the summertime, as the water goes downstream from the spring source, it's going to get warmer. In the wintertime, the farther it goes downstream from the springs, the colder it's going to get. Spring creeks sometimes have multiple springs coming into them at various locations as they go downstream. So just because the main spring is far upriver doesn't mean it's not getting fresh spring water farther downriver from a different spring. In general, tailwaters and spring creeks have a lot of food in them. They have multiple food sources. They're available all year round, some of them, because those temperatures stay consistent, and bugs can grow and hatch throughout the year regardless of what the external temperature is doing. This is why spring creeks and tailwaters tend to grow larger fish, because the fish that are in those waters have consistent temperatures year-round. That means that the bug life is more consistent. That means that those fish have more food all year round, so they grow bigger faster. And the third type of water it's important to know about is what's called a freestone river or a freestone stream. Freestone waters are generally very influenced by runoff. So you'll find them up in the mountains where they're draining the valleys and they're coming into the streams. That's a great example of a freestone stream. Unfortunately, freestone streams are also very affected by temperature changes, both hot and cold, because they don't have that constant, steady, cool water influence coming from either a spring or a dam tailwater release. Now, in a freestone stream, number one, the temperatures fluctuate a lot more, and number two, there's not food that's available to them all year round. So in the wintertime, you're going to find them at the bottom of those deep holes, and they're just down there surviving. They're not eating very much, they're not moving very much, they're just waiting for water temperatures to warm up in the spring when the bugs start moving, and then they get their energy from eating those bugs. Another thing that's very worth mentioning is that all three different types of rivers have different types of water level fluctuations. For example, tailwaters are consistent most of the year because they're regulated by how wide they open the opening at the bottom of the dam. And freestone rivers and streams are influenced the most by how much or how little it rains. They can get super low in the summertime, and they can be really high and raging in the springtime if there's been a lot of rain. I learned a lot of this information about spring creeks, tailwaters, and freestone streams from Joe Humphrey's book, Trout Tactics. And if you look at this book, the very first chapter, chapter 1, says, Finding Trout, a Matter of Degrees. And do you know what you put in chapter 1 of an educational book? Some of the most important stuff. That's because you want all of your readers to know and understand this before they read anything else in the book. So in the minds of two great anglers, temperature, more than almost anything else, dictates trout behavior and their feeding. I can't possibly stress to you enough how important these authors think that temperature is to trout's feeding and metabolism, and if they think it's important, I think it's important too. Now, there's one big exception to all of this. Let's talk about stocked trout. I have a love-hate relationship with stocked trout. Here in Virginia, there's a lot of places that aren't cold enough throughout the year, even with those cold water influences, to keep trout alive and healthy throughout the year. So there's a lot of stocked fish in my area. And while I much prefer catching wild fish, sometimes the only options that are around are stocked fish. And if it's between stocked fish or no fish, you better believe I'm going to try to catch stocked fish. The reason I say that stocked fish are an exception is because they don't necessarily know what to do. They've been fed by hand many times in their raceways as they've gotten bigger and grown, so they're not used to having to move their bodies around in the rivers to get to those optimal survival temperatures. What this means is that even though there might be a lot of stocked fish in the river, they might not be using the same temperature cues that a wild fish would to get themselves to the best feeding position. This is one of the reasons why stocked fish don't survive at the same rates as wild fish do, because they're not adapted to surviving like the wild fish are. It's another reason why stocked fish will a lot of times pod up right where they're dumped in instead of moving to those optimal feeding locations, because they don't know what that is yet. They haven't figured it out. Now, given enough time, if they survive long enough and they hold over, they'll start to figure out where they need to position themselves in the river to get those feeding benefits, but it's not something that they necessarily know as soon as they get into the river when they're stopped. Because of this, if you're using a thermometer to find trout and the trout that you're looking for are stocked trout, the laws won't hold exactly true like they might with some wild fish. There's a demographic of fishermen that I've learned a lot of things from, and those are competitive anglers. What I mean by that is people that go to fly fishing competitions, and here's why I think there's so much that can be learned from them. Many times when you're fishing in a competition, you're not fishing your favorite river that you fished your whole life, that you know exactly where the fish are going to be at each time of the year. You're walking up to a new piece of water with just a couple of days to practice, and you got to figure out where the fish are, what they're eating, and how to catch them so that when the competition day comes, you know what's going on. Because competition anglers like Devin Olson and many others have to find fish no matter where they are, they rely heavily on the water temperature as they move throughout rivers in different countries and different continents to figure out where the heck are the fish at. Now, very unlike trout, Humans are not cold-blooded. We're warm-blooded. Our bodies stay at 98.6 degrees all the time unless there's a problem. Now, even though we're warm-blooded and not cold-blooded like trout, I think it's helpful to put ourselves in the mind frame of a trout to try to understand a little bit why they do what they do. If it's really hot or really cold outside, do you feel like doing as much? Probably not. Trout work sort of the same way. Now, their energy expenditure is based on trying to get food, but if you're super uncomfortable outside, chances are that a trout might be uncomfortable as well. Imagine for a second that you're a trout, and imagine that it's super, super cold. And so you're doing everything you can to stay warm. In my case, I've got a blanket, I'm sitting on my chair, I'm just hanging out trying to keep as much body warmth as I can. If somebody walks into the room and has a piece of cake that you really want to eat, but they're all the way on the other side of the room, do you really think you're going to get up and walk all the way over there to eat the cake and get out of your cozy, comfy little spot? Maybe not. But if that same person brings that piece of cake over and puts it right in front of you and you don't even have to get up or move or take your blanket off to eat it, there's a lot better chance that you're going to eat that same piece of cake just because of where it's located in proximity to yourself. Thank you so much for watching this brook to river fly fishing tutorial on how to find trout using a thermometer and water temperature. I hope that you catch so many more trout, and when you do, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Bye.